Before this story begins, answer one question. If the person you loved most betrayed you, would you forgive them or walk away forever? Comment forgive or leave right now. I'll be reading every comment. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. My husband told me I would never survive without him 3 days before I packed my first box. He said it standing in the doorway of the kitchen I had renovated with my own inheritance, arms crossed, watching me wrap plates in newspaper like I was performing a magic trick that would obviously fail. "You don't even know how to read a mortgage statement, Danielle," he said. "You'll be back here in a month, begging me to let you move home." I didn't answer him. I had learned, over 11 years of marriage to Marcus Whitfield, that answering him in the moment only gave him more material to work with. So I kept wrapping plates, and I let the silence do what silence does best in a house like ours, which was make him uncomfortable enough to keep talking. We lived in a colonial on Birchwood Lane in Marietta, Georgia, the kind of house with a wraparound porch and a mailbox shaped like a tiny replica of the house itself, which I had always found a little ridiculous but never said so. Marcus sold commercial insurance. He was good at it, good enough that for the first 6 years of our marriage I genuinely believed the version of our finances he told me at the dinner table, the version where his commissions kept us comfortable and my job as a dental hygienist was, in his words, nice pocket money. I had heard that phrase so many times I stopped hearing it. Nice pocket money. As if the 14 years I'd spent building a career, the 2 associate's degrees, the continuing education credits I paid for out of my own account, amounted to a jar of loose change on his dresser. The trouble was, Marcus had started believing his own story more than I had. Somewhere around year 8, he stopped asking what I thought about large purchases. He bought a boat we used twice. He leased a truck that cost more per month than my car payment had cost outright. And when I asked, gently at first and then not so gently, where the money was actually coming from, he told me I didn't understand how business worked, that cash flow wasn't the same as income, that I should stick to things I understood, like scheduling cleanings and ordering floss. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story where I was purely a victim who never saw it coming. I saw pieces of it. I saw the way he flinched when the mail came. I saw him take calls in the garage with the door shut. I told myself these were things married people were allowed to have, small privacies, and that trust meant not chasing him around asking questions. What I didn't understand, not fully, not until the night everything cracked open, was that trust and denial can look identical from the inside. The cracking open happened on a Tuesday in March, at my mother-in-law's retirement dinner at a steakhouse off the Parkway, in front of 14 members of his family and mine. I had spent the better part of 2 weeks planning that dinner because Marcus asked me to, because he said his mother, Pearl, deserved something nice after 30 years teaching 2nd grade, and because despite everything, I still liked being the person who made things nice. I picked the restaurant. I called ahead about Pearl's dietary restrictions. I ordered a cake from the bakery she liked in Roswell and drove 40 minutes round trip to pick it up myself so it wouldn't get jostled in a delivery van. Dinner started well enough. Pearl cried a little when we toasted her. My sister-in-law, Renata, told a story about Pearl chasing a raccoon out of her classroom with a yardstick that had everyone laughing so hard my nephew choked on his water. For about 20 minutes, I let myself believe the evening might just be a good one. Then Marcus's brother, Cole, who had never once in 11 years asked me a single question about my own life, leaned across the table with a grin already forming and asked Marcus how the truck was running. Marcus laughed and said something about how a man needs a real vehicle, not the little hybrid I drove, and then, because apparently that wasn't quite enough, he added that at least one of them in the marriage understood that a car was supposed to say something about you, and not just get you from point A to point B like an appliance with wheels. The table laughed. I did not. I said, evenly, that my little hybrid, as he called it, had been paid for in full with my own money, and that I had never once asked him to justify how he spent his commissions, and I would appreciate the same courtesy. It wasn't an explosive thing to say. I said it the way you'd correct someone who mispronounced your name. But Marcus's face changed the way it always changed when I said something true in front of an audience he wanted to impress. He set down his fork. He said, loud enough for the whole table and half the restaurant to hear, that I should be careful about acting like I built anything on my own, because without his income, without his name on the mortgage, without him carrying us for over a decade, I would not last 2 months alone. He said it with a smile, like it was a joke, the way people say cruel things and then hide behind the shape of a laugh. Nobody laughed this time either. Pearl looked down at her plate. My mother, seated 2 chairs away, went very still, the particular stillness she gets when she's furious and refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, the way I do when I've finished eating even if I haven't, and I looked at my husband of 11 years across a table covered in the leftover evidence of a dinner I'd planned for his mother, and I said, "We'll see." That was all. 2 words. But something in the way I said them made Cole stop smiling, made Renata glance quickly between us, made Marcus's jaw tighten in a way I recognized from every other time I'd surprised him by not backing down. He didn't know it yet, sitting there in his good blazer with steak sauce on his thumb, but those 2 words were the last calm thing I would say to him for a very long time. Everything after that dinner moved fast, faster than either of us expected, and none of it moved in the direction he assumed it would. The morning after the dinner, Marcus left for work without saying goodbye, which was fine, because I had already decided I wasn't going to spend the day waiting to see whether he'd apologize. I had learned that lesson a long time ago. Apologies from Marcus arrived only when withholding them cost him something, and he hadn't yet realized what the dinner had cost him. I drove to my office in Kennesaw, cleaned 4 sets of teeth, listened to a patient named Harold tell me about his grandson's baseball tournament for 11 straight minutes, and then, on my lunch break, I sat in my car in the parking lot and did something I had been putting off for almost 2 years. I called a divorce attorney. Her name was Priya Anand, and I'd found her through a coworker who'd used her during a messy split the year before. Priya's office was small, tucked above a bakery, and when I sat down across from her desk I expected to cry. I didn't. I told her about the boat, the truck, the phrase nice pocket money, the calls in the garage with the door shut. I told her about the dinner. She wrote things down in a small looping hand and then set her pen down and said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. People like your husband, she said, usually aren't lying about the big things. They're lying about the small ones, over and over, until the big thing is built entirely out of small lies and nobody notices because each individual lie was too small to fight about. She asked whether I had access to our joint accounts. I said I did, though Marcus handled most of what he called the real finances, meaning the business accounts tied to his insurance work, the ones I had never once been asked to look at. Priya told me, gently but clearly, that before I did anything else, before I said another word to Marcus about divorce, I needed to understand exactly what we had, what we owed, and what he might be hiding. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis you already suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. I spent the next 10 days living a kind of double life. At home, I was ordinary. I made dinner. I asked Marcus about his day. I let him believe the dinner at the steakhouse had been absorbed the way every other unpleasant thing between us had been absorbed, filed away under things we don't talk about. But in the evenings, after he fell asleep in front of the television, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad and I went through every statement I could access. Checking. Savings. The joint credit card. The mortgage document, which I dug out of the fireproof box in the closet and read from beginning to end for the first time in 6 years. What I found first was smaller than what I would eventually find, but it still made my stomach drop. We were behind on the mortgage. Not catastrophically, not yet, but 2 payments behind, with a late notice tucked into a stack of unopened mail in Marcus's home office that I had never once gone looking through, because I had trusted him to handle the mail the way I trusted him to handle 100 other things I had quietly, unconsciously, handed over to him across a decade of marriage. I found a credit card I didn't know existed, opened 18 months earlier, with a balance of just under $19,000. Restaurant charges. A jewelry store in Buckhead I had never set foot in. A hotel 2 towns over, charged 4 separate times across 4 separate months, each charge landing on a Thursday. I sat with that particular fact for a long time. Thursdays. Marcus had a standing golf game on Thursdays, one he'd had for years, one I had never questioned because questioning it seemed like exactly the kind of small, petty jealousy I didn't want to become. I did not confront him that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was that I understood, sitting there at 1 a.m. with a legal pad full of numbers, that if I said anything before I had the full picture, he would spend the next several weeks controlling the narrative, smoothing things over, moving money, calling it a misunderstanding. I had watched him do that with smaller things my entire marriage. I wasn't going to hand him the chance to do it with something this large. So instead, I did what I do best, which is plan quietly and methodically, the same way I'd once planned his mother's retirement dinner, except this time the guest of honor was my own future. I opened an account at a different bank, one Marcus had never used, using money from a small inheritance my grandmother had left me years earlier that I'd kept separate out of some instinct I hadn't fully examined until now. I called Priya back and told her what I'd found. She told me, calmly, that a hidden credit card and a pattern of hotel charges were the kind of thing that could matter a great deal in a divorce, both financially and otherwise, and that I should keep documenting everything before I said a single word to him. I started keeping a folder. Bank statements. Screenshots. The late mortgage notice, photographed on my phone before I slid it back exactly where I'd found it. I felt, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, like I was standing on solid ground instead of sand, even though the ground I was standing on was made entirely of evidence that my marriage had been quietly failing for longer than I'd let myself see. 3 days after I opened that new account, Marcus came home early, which he never did, and found me at the kitchen table with the legal pad still out. I hadn't expected him. I didn't have time to close the laptop or slide the pad away. He stood in the doorway, the same doorway where he'd once told me I'd never survive without him, and looked at the numbers spread across the table, and something in his face shifted from confusion into something colder. "What is this?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed up as one, the way most things out of his mouth had started to sound to me over the past several weeks. I looked up at him and, for the second time in 10 days, I didn't flinch. "This," I said, tapping the legal pad, "is a $19,000 credit card you opened without telling me. This is a mortgage that's 2 payments behind. This is 4 hotel charges on 4 separate Thursdays." I kept my voice level. I had practiced this, oddly enough, on my drive home, rehearsing it the way I used to rehearse difficult conversations with dental patients about bad news: deliver the facts plainly, don't soften them so much that the truth gets lost. Marcus's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise. Then something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight he'd been carrying alone had finally been set down, even if it had been set down in the worst possible way. Then, because this was Marcus, the relief curdled fast into defensiveness. "You've been going through my things," he said. "I've been going through our things," I said. "There's a difference, and you know there is, because you're the one who decided which parts of our finances were mine to see and which parts weren't." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily, and for a moment I thought, absurdly, that he might actually tell me the truth. Instead he told me a story. He said the credit card was for a business expense account, something to do with client entertainment, that the mortgage payments had been delayed because of a cash flow issue with a commission that hadn't cleared yet, that the hotel charges were for out-of-town clients he'd been meeting with, developers who preferred face-to-face meetings over coffee in a hotel lobby rather than his office. I let him finish. I have found, in the years since, that letting someone finish their lie in full, without interrupting, is one of the most useful things you can do, because a whole lie has more holes in it than a half-told one. "On Thursdays," I said. "During your golf game." "I don't play golf every Thursday." "You've played golf every Thursday for 6 years, Marcus." I could set a clock by it. He didn't have an answer for that. Instead he reached for anger, which was always his fallback position when a lie stopped working, the same anger he'd reached for at his mother's retirement dinner, the same anger dressed up as wounded pride that had worked on me more times than I liked to admit over 11 years. "You're really doing this," he said. "You're really going to sit here and interrogate me like I'm some criminal, over a few charges, after everything I've done for this family. After I've carried us for years. You'd be sitting in an apartment somewhere counting pennies if it weren't for me, and this is the thanks I get." There it was again. The same sentence, differently dressed. "You'll never survive without me." It had become a kind of chorus in our marriage, a thing he returned to whenever he needed me smaller than I actually was. "I want a divorce," I said. I hadn't planned to say it that night. I'd planned to gather more, to wait for Priya's advice on timing, to be strategic the way she'd told me to be. But something about hearing that sentence again, about carrying us, about counting pennies, made the words come out of me before I'd decided to let them. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the sound people make when they're trying to convince themselves something isn't happening. "You're not serious." "I've never been more serious about anything." "You'll change your mind in a week." "I won't." "You don't even know how to read a mortgage statement, Danielle." He said it like it was still true, like the last 10 days hadn't just proven, in exhaustive and documented detail, that I understood our mortgage statement considerably better than he did. "You'll last a month on your own. Maybe less. And when you come crawling back, and you will, don't expect me to make it easy for you." I stood up from the table. I gathered the legal pad, the folder, the laptop, and I looked at him one more time, at this man I had loved through 11 years, through 2 miscarriages we never fully talked about, through his father's funeral, through the ordinary erosion of a marriage that neither of us had noticed happening until it had already happened. "We'll see," I said again. 2 words. The same 2 words from the steakhouse. And I watched something in his face flicker, just slightly, the first small crack of doubt I'd seen in him in longer than I could remember. I moved into my sister's guest room that weekend. I told myself it was temporary, a place to think, but somewhere underneath the temporary framing I already knew it was the beginning of something permanent. My sister, Renee, didn't ask many questions at first. She'd never liked Marcus, not really, not since the wedding, when he'd made a toast that was ostensibly about me but somehow spent most of its time describing how lucky I was to have found him. She made up the guest room with fresh sheets and told me to stay as long as I needed, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through an entire night without waking up at 3 in the morning running numbers in my head. Priya filed the paperwork the following Monday. Marcus was served at his office, which I hadn't planned deliberately but which I also didn't particularly regret when I found out later how it had happened, a process server catching him in the parking lot outside his building, in front of 2 coworkers, holding a manila envelope while his face went through the same sequence of surprise, relief, and anger I'd watched at the kitchen table, except this time there was no one there for him to perform the anger at except a stranger holding a clipboard. He called me 11 times that day. I didn't answer any of them. I had learned, finally, after 11 years, that the version of myself who needed to answer every one of Marcus's calls no longer existed, and I found I did not miss her. The weeks that followed had a strange double quality to them, the way I imagine grief must feel for people who've lost someone gradually, through illness, rather than all at once. Some days I felt lighter than I had in years, waking up in my sister's guest room to sunlight instead of the low hum of dread I hadn't realized I'd been carrying every morning of my marriage. Other days I felt like I'd stepped off solid ground into something I couldn't see the bottom of. I want to talk about the practical things, because I think people who tell these stories sometimes skip past them in favor of the dramatic parts, and the practical things are where the real survival happens. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in a converted mill building in Marietta, close enough to my office that I could walk on nice days. I set up automatic payments the way I'd always wanted to and never had, because Marcus had insisted on handling the real bills himself. I opened a retirement account in my own name, something I realized with a small jolt of shame I had never done in 11 years of marriage, having simply assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise, that whatever Marcus had set up covered both of us. It didn't. It had never covered both of us. It had covered him, and a version of our life he'd built mostly on debt I hadn't known existed. Priya's forensic accountant, a quiet, precise man named Walter Igioma, went through everything over the next several weeks with the kind of patience I found oddly comforting. He found what I'd found, the credit card, the mortgage arrears, the hotel charges, and then he found more. A second credit card, opened even earlier than the first, with a balance that had been paid down and then run up again in a cycle that suggested, Walter said carefully, a pattern rather than an emergency. A personal loan Marcus had taken out against his life insurance policy, one that listed me as a co-signer through a signature. Walter said, after comparing it to samples of my actual handwriting, did not appear to match mine with any confidence. I sat in Priya's office when she told me that part, and for the first time since the dinner at the steakhouse, I cried. Not because of the money, though the money mattered, but because it meant that somewhere along the way, my husband had decided that forging my name was an acceptable cost of keeping his version of our life running a little longer. Priya was careful with me in that meeting in a way I appreciated. She didn't tell me what to feel. She told me what our options were. We could pursue it as fraud, which would take time and would almost certainly make the divorce uglier and slower, or we could use it as leverage in the settlement negotiations, letting the threat of it do the work instead of the accusation itself. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I told her I wanted both doors open. I wasn't interested in destroying Marcus. I was interested in making sure he understood, completely and permanently, that he could no longer build his life on the assumption that I would quietly absorb the cost of it. Word travels fast in a town the size of ours, especially through a family the size of Marcus's. Pearl called me 3 weeks after I moved out, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She said she'd heard I'd filed for divorce and she wanted to know if it was true, and when I told her it was, she was quiet for a long moment before she said something I hadn't expected. I always wondered where the money went, she said. He used to ask me for loans, you know. Small ones. I never told you because I didn't want to cause trouble between you two. She paused. I think I did you a disservice, not telling you. I told her she hadn't owed me anything, which was true, but I also understood, hanging up the phone, that Marcus had been quietly borrowing from more people than just me for longer than I'd known. Cole reached out too, unexpectedly, not to defend his brother but to apologize, in his own clumsy way, for the comment about the truck at dinner. I didn't know things were like that, he said, which I took to mean he hadn't known about the money, only about the general temperature of contempt Marcus had been directing at me for longer than either of us had wanted to admit out loud. I appreciated the apology more than I expected to. Meanwhile, Marcus's version of events, as it filtered back to me through Renee, through Pearl, through a co-worker of his who happened to date a friend of mine, was that I had blindsided him, that I'd gone through his private accounts, that I was punishing him for a single joke at a family dinner that had gotten blown out of proportion. He told people I'd taken money from our joint accounts, which was technically true, in the sense that I had moved a portion of my own earnings into an account he could no longer access, out of the accounts he had been quietly draining for over a year. I didn't correct the story publicly. Priya advised against it, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to fight a narrative war on top of everything else. I focused instead on the parts of my life that were actually, finally, mine to build. I picked up an extra shift at the office, not because I needed the money urgently but because I wanted to watch my own account grow under my own name, a small, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with Marcus at all. I started running in the mornings, something I'd stopped doing years earlier when Marcus had made an offhand comment about how it made me too tired to be good company in the evenings. I hadn't even noticed I'd stopped for him until I started again for myself. 3 weeks and 2 days after I moved out, on a Thursday, of all days, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was Marcus's landlord. His name was Desmond Trask, and he owned a small block of townhouses off Cobb Parkway where, it turned out, Marcus had been renting a place for the past several weeks, ever since I'd moved out, and he'd apparently decided the house on Birchwood Lane was too expensive to maintain alone, or perhaps too full of the version of himself he no longer wanted to look at. Desmond explained, in the patient tone of a man who had clearly made this kind of call before, that Marcus was 31 days late on rent, that his check had bounced twice, and that Desmond had found my number listed as an emergency contact on the rental application. I told him, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, that Marcus and I were in the middle of a divorce and that I was not in a position to be responsible for his rent. Desmond apologized for bothering me and said he understood, and that he'd already begun the eviction process. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Marcus had told him during the application process that his wife handled their finances and that Desmond shouldn't worry about the income verification being a little thin, because everything would sort itself out once the divorce settled. I sat with that sentence for a long time after I hung up. Even in leaving me, even in building a story to explain away his own instability to a stranger, Marcus had found a way to make it my fault. I didn't tell him I knew about the eviction. I didn't reach out at all. I went back to my life, to my mornings running along the Mill Creek Trail behind my apartment, to my afternoons at the office, to the slow, steady work of rebuilding something that felt entirely mine. The rest of it came out in pieces over the following days, the way these things always seem to, through people who couldn't resist telling other people. Marcus's insurance office, it turned out, had placed him on an unpaid leave 2 months earlier, quietly, after a client complained about a policy that had lapsed without notice, a policy Marcus had apparently been meaning to renew with client funds he'd instead used to cover the second credit card. He hadn't told me any of this. He had continued getting dressed every morning and leaving the house as though he were going to work, driving somewhere, I still don't know exactly where, for 8 hours a day, maintaining the fiction of a job he no longer had, right up until the week I moved out. Without a paycheck, without the house, without the credit cards that had finally been frozen once Walter's findings went into the official filing, Marcus's carefully maintained version of himself had nowhere left to stand. The truck was repossessed on a Tuesday, towed from the parking lot of the townhouse complex while, according to Desmond, Marcus stood on the sidewalk in his bathrobe arguing with the tow driver about paperwork that didn't exist. The boat had already been sold months earlier, quietly, without my knowledge, which Walter discovered buried in a transaction that had, at the time, been dressed up in the joint account ledger as a consulting payment received. I heard about the truck from Renee, who heard about it from a mutual friend, who happened to live 2 streets over from the townhouse complex and had watched the whole thing from her porch with the particular fascination small towns reserve for the unraveling of someone who had, for years, acted like the rules were for other people. 3 weeks to the day after I'd moved into my sister's guest room, on a Thursday evening, I was walking back from my run along the Mill Creek Trail, my building's lobby just coming into view through the trees, when I saw a figure sitting on the low stone wall outside the entrance. For a moment I thought it was one of my new neighbors. Then the figure stood up, and even in the fading light, even after 3 weeks apart, I recognized the particular way Marcus held his shoulders when he was trying to look composed and failing. He looked smaller than I remembered him. Not physically, though he had lost weight in a way that suggested more stress than intention, but smaller in the way a person looks when the story they've been telling about themselves has finally collapsed and they haven't yet built a new one to stand inside. "Danielle," he said. "I need to talk to you." I stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear him, far enough that I didn't feel obligated to let him closer. "You could have called. You would have ignored it." "Probably," I admitted. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from 100 small arguments over 11 years, the physical shape of a man working up to saying something he didn't want to say. "I lost the apartment," he said. "I got let go from the firm 2 months ago. I should have told you, I know I should have told you, but I kept thinking I'd fix it before it mattered. And now the truck's gone, and I don't have anywhere to stay tonight, and I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I'm asking anyway. Can I stay with you? Just for a few nights. Just until I figure something out." I stood there on the sidewalk outside the building I had chosen for myself, paid for with money I now controlled entirely on my own, and I looked at the man who 3 weeks earlier had told me I would never survive without him, standing in front of me now with nowhere to go, asking me to survive for him. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think the truth is more useful than the version of this story where I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. I felt several things at once, layered on top of each other like sediment. There was a flicker, small but real, of the old instinct, the one that had spent 11 years making sure Marcus was fed and comfortable and never inconvenienced, the instinct that wanted to say of course, come in, we'll figure it out. There was pity, too, looking at him standing there in a jacket that had clearly been slept in, his composure held together with something that looked more like exhaustion than dignity. And underneath both of those, steady and unmistakable, there was clarity. No, I said. He blinked like I'd slapped him. Danielle, come on. It's one night. Maybe two. You forged my signature on a loan application, Marcus. His mouth opened, then closed. Whatever he'd rehearsed on the walk over, whatever version of this conversation he'd built in his head, it clearly hadn't accounted for me already knowing that particular fact. I can explain that, he said, though his voice had lost the confident edge it usually carried when he was explaining things to me. You can explain it to Walter, I said. He's the forensic accountant Priya hired. He's the one who found it. It's already part of the filing. Something in his face went pale in the porch light. You're trying to ruin me. No, I said, and I found, saying it, that it was completely true. I'm trying to stop absorbing the cost of you ruining yourself. Those are different things, even if they don't feel different to you right now. He was quiet for a long moment. A car passed on the street behind him, headlights sweeping briefly across his face, and in that light I saw something I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever, a kind of naked uncertainty, the particular look of a man who has run out of stories to tell. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and for a second I almost stepped forward, almost let the old instinct win. But I thought about the mortgage statements, the hotel charges on 4 separate Thursdays, the sentence he'd said twice now, in 2 different tones, 3 weeks apart. You'll never survive without me. You'll last a month, maybe less. I think, I said, you're supposed to do what I did. Figure it out. On your own. The way I've been doing for 3 weeks. That's not the same thing and you know it. It's exactly the same thing, Marcus. I just did it without telling anyone it was hard. He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there a moment longer, and I watched him consider several more things to say, several more angles, and I watched him discard all of them, maybe because he was too tired to perform anymore, or maybe because some part of him finally understood that performing wasn't going to work on me a second time. Pearl might let you stay with her, I offered, because even in that moment, some old habit of softness in me didn't want to leave him standing on a sidewalk with nothing. I don't know. That's between you and her. He nodded slowly, not quite meeting my eyes. Yeah, he said. Maybe. I turned and walked into my building without looking back, and I want to tell you that I felt triumphant, the way these stories sometimes promise you'll feel, but what I actually felt, riding the elevator up to my apartment, was quieter than that. I felt like a door had finally, fully closed, and that the sound of it closing was not violent or dramatic but simply final, the way a good lock sounds when it clicks into place. I called Renee that night and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Are you okay?" And I realized I actually was. Not happy, not yet, that would come later, in smaller and steadier ways than I expected. But okay. Solid. Standing on ground that belonged to me. The divorce finalized 4 months later. Priya negotiated a settlement that gave me a larger share of the marital assets than I'd initially expected, partly because of the forged signature, which Marcus's lawyer clearly wanted to avoid litigating in open court, and partly because Walter's documentation was so thorough that there wasn't much room left for Marcus's usual talent for reframing the story. I didn't get everything back. Attorney's fees and months of accumulated debt saw to that. But I got enough, and more importantly, I got out with my name, my credit, and my sense of myself fully intact, which was worth more to me than any dollar figure Walter could have put in a spreadsheet. Marcus moved in with Pearl for a while, I heard, and eventually found work at a smaller agency 2 counties over, the kind of job Priya said, with a slight lift of her eyebrow, tended to go to people rebuilding a reputation rather than launching one. I don't know much more than that. I stopped asking Renee for updates somewhere around the 6-month mark, not out of anger, but because I noticed I'd simply stopped being curious. I want to tell you about the year that followed, because I think it matters more than the drama of the divorce itself, more than the sidewalk conversation outside my building, more than even the moment at the kitchen table when I finally said the words "I want a divorce" out loud for the first time. The drama gets people's attention. But it's the year after that actually rebuilds a life, and I think that part gets skipped too often in stories like this one, in favor of the satisfying ending. I don't want to skip it, because it wasn't always satisfying while it was happening. It was slow, and some weeks it was boring, and boring turned out to be exactly what I needed. I kept the 2-bedroom apartment in the Mill building for the first year, even after the settlement came through and I technically could have afforded something larger. I liked it there. I liked the sound of the creek at night, I liked walking distance to my office, I liked that every object in it had been chosen by me, for me, without anyone's opinion factored in except my own. I turned the 2nd bedroom into an office, something I'd never had in 11 years of marriage despite working full-time the entire span of it, and I put a second-hand desk in front of the window and did my continuing education coursework there in the evenings, finally pursuing a certification in periodontal therapy I'd talked about getting for years and never had, partly because Marcus used to say it seemed like a lot of extra work for not much extra money, a sentence I now recognized as one of 1,000 small ways he had, without ever quite forbidding anything outright, kept me slightly smaller than I wanted to be. I got the certification. It took me 8 months of night classes on top of full-time work, and there were evenings I came home exhausted and briefly wondered whether it was worth it, whether I was punishing myself with busy work instead of resting the way a person recovering from a divorce was supposed to rest. But something in me needed to build things now, tangible things, proof that the 11 years hadn't erased my capacity to grow. When the certification came through, I framed it and hung it in my new office, not because I needed to prove anything to Marcus, who never saw it, but because I needed to prove something to the version of myself who had once believed she couldn't read a mortgage statement. Pearl and I stayed in touch, oddly enough, in a way that surprised both of us. She started calling me every few weeks, not about Marcus, mostly, but about her garden, or a book she was reading, or a former student who'd tracked her down on social media to thank her for something she'd said in 2nd grade 20 years earlier. I think, in her own way, Pearl had decided that I was still family, or maybe more accurately, that family wasn't only the shape the law had drawn around us, and she wasn't willing to let a divorce erase a friendship that had grown up alongside a marriage even after the marriage ended. Renee and I grew closer too, in the particular way sisters sometimes do when one of them finally stops performing a happy life for the other's benefit. She told me once, over wine on her porch about 6 months after I moved out of her guest room and into my own place, that she'd known for years something was wrong, that she'd watched me get smaller at family dinners, quieter, more careful, and that she'd never known how to say something without it sounding like an attack on my marriage. I should have said something, she said. I told her she didn't owe me that some things a person has to see for themselves, in their own time, and that I didn't think earlier interference from her would have changed anything, because I hadn't been ready to hear it. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I believe it helped her, and I believed it enough myself to let it be true. At work, something shifted too, something I hadn't expected. My supervising dentist, Dr. Okafor, pulled me aside about 10 months after the divorce finalized and told me the practice was opening a second location in Woodstock and asked if I'd be interested in managing it, given my new certification and, as she put it, the way you've handled the last year. I hadn't realized anyone at the office had been paying attention to the last year at all, but apparently the quiet, steady competence I'd been rebuilding my life with hadn't gone unnoticed. I said yes before I'd even fully thought through the logistics, because some new, sturdier part of me had learned to say yes to things that scared me a little, instead of waiting for permission that wasn't coming from anyone but myself. I want to mention, too, because I think it's part of the honest shape of this story, that I dated a little during that year, cautiously, without much urgency. Nothing serious came of it, not because the men I met were unkind, but because I found I wasn't in a hurry, that the version of myself who had once believed she needed a marriage to feel complete had quietly, without ceremony, stopped existing sometime during those first 3 weeks in Renee's guest room. I liked my own company more than I expected to. I liked cooking meals only I would eat, taking trips only I would plan, making decisions that answered to no one's approval but my own. The last time I saw Marcus in person was almost exactly a year after the sidewalk conversation outside my building, at, of all places, Pearl's birthday lunch, which she insisted on hosting at the same steakhouse off the parkway where the retirement dinner had unraveled a year earlier. I almost didn't go. I told Pearl as much, gently, and she told me, just as gently, that she understood if I couldn't, but that she wanted me there if I felt able, because I was still, in her words, the daughter who showed up, a phrase that undid me a little when I heard it, because it was true in a way I hadn't fully let myself feel until she said it. I decided to go. I told myself it was for Pearl, and mostly it was, but I'll admit there was a small part of me curious to see what a year had done to Marcus, curious whether I'd feel anything at all. He was already seated when I arrived, at the far end of the table, and I noticed several things quickly, the way you notice things about a person you used to know intimately and now only observe from a careful distance. He'd put weight back on, which I registered as a good sign, evidence that whatever crisis point I'd witnessed on the sidewalk a year earlier had passed into something more stable. He was wearing a shirt I didn't recognize, plain, unremarkable, nothing like the expensive, performative wardrobe he'd favored during our marriage. When he saw me come in, something crossed his face that wasn't quite the old confidence and wasn't quite the old anger either. It looked, more than anything, like recognition of a person he used to know. We didn't talk much during lunch. I sat near Renee, he sat near Cole, and the conversation moved around us the way rivers move around stones, finding paths that didn't require us to speak directly to each other. Near the end of the meal, though, while Pearl was opening a gift from her sister, Marcus caught my eye across the table, and after a moment, he got up and came around to where I was sitting, and crouched down slightly so we could speak without the whole table hearing. "I wanted to say something," he said, "and I've been trying to figure out how for a while." He paused, and I noticed his hands were steady, which they hadn't been the last time we'd spoken, on the sidewalk, in the dark. I was wrong. About a lot of it. Not just the money, though obviously that too. I was wrong about you, about what you could handle, about what you'd built. I spent so long needing you to need me that I never actually looked at what you were capable of. I'm sorry for that. I don't expect it to change anything. I just wanted you to hear it. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the dinner, the 2 words I'd said twice, the sidewalk, the year of quiet, deliberate rebuilding that had gotten me here, to a version of myself I liked considerably more than the one who'd once believed she couldn't read a mortgage statement. I thought about how satisfying it might have felt, a year earlier, to hear this exact apology, and how strange it was that now, hearing it, I mostly just felt calm, the particular calm of a person for whom an old debt has finally, quietly, been settled, not because the money changed hands, but because the truth finally had. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, and I meant it, without bitterness and without warmth either, just the plain, level tone I'd learned to use with him a year earlier at that same kitchen table where everything had first cracked open. "I hope things keep going well for you." "They are," he said. Slowly. "But they are." He straightened up, hesitated a moment longer, and then added, almost like an afterthought, though I suspect it was the thing he'd actually walked over to say, "You were right, by the way. About surviving." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. He walked back to his seat, and Pearl finished opening her gift, a scarf, pale green, and held it up for the table to admire, and the lunch continued around us the way ordinary lunches do, and that was, as far as I know, the last real conversation Marcus and I ever had. I drove home from that lunch with the windows down, even though it was cold enough that Renee, riding beside me, complained twice before giving up and putting on her jacket instead of asking me to roll them up. I wasn't trying to make a point. I just wanted the air on my face, the particular feeling of movement, of going somewhere under my own power, which had become, over the past year, the thing I valued most out of everything I'd rebuilt. I think about that steakhouse sometimes, the same restaurant where a joke about my hybrid car had turned into the loudest, cruelest sentence Marcus ever said to me, and I think about how the same room, a year later, held something almost like closure instead, quiet and undramatic, the way real endings usually are. Real life doesn't sound like the movies. It sounds like a man crouching beside a chair, admitting something true, and a woman who used to shrink in that same restaurant sitting up a little straighter, not because she needed the apology, but because she'd already built a life sturdy enough to receive it without being knocked over by it either way. 2 years out from the divorce, I stood in the doorway of the Woodstock office on its opening day, watching the first patients trickle in through doors I had personally chosen the color for, a soft, unremarkable gray that Dr. Okafor teased me about, saying I'd finally found a color as calm as I'd become. The practice grew faster than either of us expected. Within a year I had 2 hygienists working under me, a title on the door that read clinical manager, and a salary that, for the first time in my adult life, I never once had to explain or justify to anyone across a dinner table. I bought a house that spring, a small brick bungalow on a quiet street in Woodstock, nothing like the colonial on Birchwood Lane with its wraparound porch and its mailbox shaped like a miniature version of itself. This house had a modest front stoop and a single maple tree in the yard that I planted myself, badly, the roots slightly crooked, and which I now watch grow a little taller every spring from my kitchen window, a small, living proof that things planted crooked can still take root and thrive if you give them enough time and enough light. My mother came to see the house the week I closed on it, and when we reached the kitchen, she stopped and looked at me for a long moment before she said, "You built this? All of it? Yourself?" I told her I'd had help, Priya, Walter, Renee, Pearl in her own unexpected way, and my mother shook her head and said that help is something you have to be capable of using well, and that plenty of people get offered the exact same help I'd gotten and still manage to waste it, still manage to stay small out of habit even once the door is open. I hadn't done that. I'd walked through. I think about the woman I was at that steakhouse dinner sometimes, folding her napkin, saying 2 quiet words instead of the scream she probably wanted to let out, and I feel something close to tenderness for her, the way you might feel towards someone younger than you, someone who didn't yet know what she was capable of but who had, somehow, already decided not to back down. I think about the version of me at the kitchen table, going through statements at 1 in the morning with a heating pad against my back, teaching myself in real time that trust and denial can look identical from the inside, and I feel something like gratitude toward her too, for doing the unglamorous, unwitnessed work that nobody claps for, the spreadsheets and the phone calls and the quiet decision to gather proof before reacting. And I think, most of all, about the version of me standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, 3 weeks after I moved out, looking at a man who had told me twice, in 2 different tones, that I would never survive without him, and telling him no. Not out of cruelty. I've turned that moment over in my mind more times than I can count in the years since, and I've never once found cruelty at the bottom of it. What I found instead, every time, was something closer to self-respect, the specific, hard-won kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply refuses, quietly and permanently, to be talked out of what it already knows to be true. Marcus, as far as I understand from the occasional update that reaches me through Pearl, has rebuilt a smaller, steadier version of his own life, working at that agency 2 counties over, living in a modest apartment he pays for, as far as I know, entirely on his own. I don't wish him harm. I think there was a time, in the rawest weeks right after the divorce, when I might have, when the anger was close enough to the surface that a small, human part of me wanted to see him lose more than he did. But anger like that has a shelf life, if you let it run its course honestly instead of feeding it, and mine expired somewhere in that second year, replaced by something far more useful, which was simply indifference, the particular piece of no longer needing anything from a person who once told you your survival depended on him. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the people who tell you loudest that you can't survive without them are very often the people most afraid of what happens when you discover that you can. Marcus wasn't wrong that leaving would be hard. It was hard. There were nights in my sister's guest room when I lay awake doing math in my head, terrified I'd made a catastrophic mistake, certain I'd wake up in a month exactly as broke and dependent as he'd promised I would be. But hard and impossible are not the same word, no matter how convincingly someone who benefits from your staying small might insist that they are. I finished my run this morning the way I finish most mornings now, along a new trail near my house in Woodstock, past the maple tree I planted crooked, up the front steps of a home that belongs to no one but me. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I chose, in the house I bought, and I looked out at a yard that is entirely, unremarkably, wonderfully mine, and I thought about how 3 weeks was all it took, 3 weeks between the night a man stood in my doorway certain I would fail and the night that same man stood outside my building with nowhere left to go, asking the woman he'd underestimated to save him. I didn't save him. I saved myself. And 2 years later, standing in a doorway of my own choosing, in a life built entirely out of decisions no one else gets to make for me anymore, I can say without any doubt at all that it was the single best thing I have ever done. Renee asked me once, over dinner on the anniversary of the night I signed the lease on the Mill Building apartment, whether I ever regretted the years I spent married to Marcus, whether I saw them as time wasted. I thought about it for longer than she probably expected me to, and then I told her the truth, which surprised even me a little as I said it out loud. I didn't regret them. I regretted, if anything, how long it took me to stop believing a story that had never once been fully true, the story that my competence was smaller than it was, that my name on a mortgage document meant less than his, that my survival was a favor someone else was granting me rather than a fact about who I had always, quietly, actually been. Those 11 years taught me things I carry into every part of my life now, not the lessons Marcus intended to teach me, but real ones nonetheless. I learned to read a document before I sign it, every time, without exception, a habit that has served me well far beyond marriage, in leases and loans and the paperwork of running a clinical practice with 2 hygienists who depend on me getting the details right. I learned that silence, used carefully, is not weakness, that the 2 words we'll see can carry more weight than an hour of shouting ever could, if you say them and then actually follow through on what they promise. I learned that help, real help, the kind Priya and Walter and Renee and even, eventually, Pearl gave me, only does its work if you're willing to walk through the door it opens instead of standing outside admiring how kind it was of someone to open it. And I learned, most of all, that the version of a marriage where one person quietly disappears into being useful, into being the person who plans the retirement dinners and calls ahead about the walker and orders the cake from the bakery 40 minutes away, is not a partnership at all, no matter how many years it lasts or how convincingly it's dressed up as one. A partnership is 2 people building something together in the open, with both names on the important documents and both voices in the important decisions. What Marcus and I had, for most of 11 years, was something else, something that looked enough like a partnership from a distance to fool even me, for a very long time, until a single sentence at a birthday dinner cracked it open wide enough for me to finally see all the way through. I don't know what happened to the house on Birchwood Lane. I heard, second-hand, that it sold about 18 months after the divorce, to a young couple with 2 kids and a golden retriever, and I hope, genuinely, that whatever they build inside those walls looks nothing like what I built there. As for me, I still keep that legal pad, the original one, in a drawer in my office at the Woodstock house, not because I need it anymore, but because I like having it nearby, a physical reminder of the exact moment I decided to stop assuming and start knowing. Some mornings, working through invoices for the practice, I catch a glimpse of it in the drawer and feel, briefly, the strange gratitude survivors sometimes feel toward the very worst nights of their lives, the ones that, however unwillingly, taught them exactly how strong they already were. Marcus told me I would never survive without him, standing in a doorway, certain of his own importance in a way that only people who have never truly tested themselves can afford to be. 3 weeks later, he was the one standing outside, asking to come in. I think about that reversal often, not with triumph exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that in the beginning, but mostly now with a kind of settled clarity, the understanding that survival was never actually his to grant or withhold in the first place. It was mine all along. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for me to notice. And I did notice. I noticed at that kitchen table, going through statements at 1 a.m. I noticed on the sidewalk outside my building, saying no to a man who had nowhere else to go. I noticed at the steakhouse a year later, hearing an apology I no longer needed but was glad, in some small way, to receive. And I notice it still, every ordinary morning, standing in the kitchen of a house that belongs entirely to me, looking out at a crooked little maple tree that somehow, against all my early doubts about whether I'd planted it correctly, has grown taller every single year since. Some things, it turns out, take root exactly the way they're meant to, even when they start out a little unsteady, even when someone once stood in a doorway and swore they never would.